Chapter 13: The Rise of Mass Democracy, the Bank War. President Jackson did not hate all banks and all businesses, but he distrusted monopolistic banking and over big businesses, as did his followers. A man of brilliant dislikes, he came to share the prejudices of his own West against the moneyed monster known as the Bank of the United States. What made the bank a monster in Jackson's eyes? The national government minted gold and silver coins in the mid 19th century, but not issue paper money. Paper notes were printed by private banks. Their value fluctuated with the health of the bank and the amount of money printed, giving private bankers considerable power over the nation's economy. No bank in America had more power than the Bank of the United States. In many ways, the bank acted like a branch of government. It was a principal depository for the funds of the Washington government and controlled much of the nation's gold and silver. Its notes, unlike those of many smaller banks, were stable in value, a value of credit and stability. The bank was an important and useful part of the nation's expanding economy. But the Bank of the United States was a private institution, accountable not to the people, but to its elite circle of moneyed investors. Its president, the brilliant but arrogant Nicholas Biddle, held an immense and too many unconstitutional amount of power over the nation's financial affairs. Enemies of the bank dubbed him Tsar Nicholas I and called him the bank of a hydra of corruption, a serpent that grew new heads whenever old ones were cut off. All right, so let's go back and break this down. A couple things that you want to understand in these first two paragraphs, right? In this paragraph right here, I mean, it's obviously showing that President Jackson is not a big fan at all about the national bank, right? He's very critical of it. In fact, it shows that in some ways he favors more of these private banks, although at this time it was a lot more unstable. Another thing that you want to make sure you understand here is another reason why he's not a fan of the national bank, specifically because the Bank of the United States was a private institution. It was accountable not to the people, but to its elite circle of money investors. So what this means is Andrew Jackson is very critical of the people that are running the bank. He feels that they're the wealthy elite, and the decisions that they make are, of course, corrupted and only beneficial to those of their social class. This is important to know because Andrew Jackson, remember, he is a common man. You know, he represents the humble farmer, the laborer, right? And you can kind of see this. So the first three paragraphs, it is obvious that he is not a fan of the national bank, and he wishes to diminish the power because of the corruption of individuals such as Nicholas Biddle. To some, the bank's very existence seemed to sin against the egalitarian credo of American democracy. The conviction formed the deepest source of Jackson's opposition. The banks also won no friends in the West by foreclosing on many Western farms and draining tribute into Eastern coffers. Profit, not public service, was its first priority. So another thing that you want to understand in this paragraph, what foreclosing means is taking that land away, right? Because people aren't able to make those payments. So what's going on here is this claim that the author makes is that the bank's very existence seems to sin against the egalitarian credo of American democracy, right? That in general, that the bank is here to make profit, and as a result of that, it's doing things such as foreclosing Western farms and forcing the lower class and middle class to kind of just pay the bank, right? Because its purpose is to make profit. And Jackson's not at all really happy with this. Once again, he sees it as corrupt. The bank war erupted in 1832 when Daniel Webster and Henry Clay presented Congress with a bill to renew the Bank of the United States Charter, right? So every few years ago, remember that the bank needs to be renewed. And in 1832, Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, of course, are debating this bill. The charter was not set to expire until 1836, but Clay pushed for renewal 4 years early to make it an election issue in 1832. As Jackson's leading rival for presidency, Clay, with fateful blindness, looked upon the bank issue as a surefire winner. Clay's scheme was to ram a recharter bill through Congress and then send it onto the White House. If Jackson signed it, he would alienate his worshipful Western followers. If he vetoed it, it seemed certain he would presumably lose the presidency in the forthcoming election by alienating the wealthy and influential groups in the East. claim seems to not have fully realized that the best people are now only a minority and they generally fear Jackson anyhow. So, as stated, what's going on here is the rechartering bill. Rechartering the bank is going to go ahead and come to the White House. And what this paragraph is saying is if he signs it, he's basically hurting the frontiersmen. He's hurting those farmers that are moving westward because these banks are taking advantage of them. However, if he vetoes it, meaning he refuses to sign it, the wealthy elite would then not vote for him. But what the author is saying here is that in many ways that times have changed. And remember, Jackson now represents the common man, and these people may vote in favor of Jackson if he vetoes this bill. The recharter bill slid through Congress on grease skids, as planned, but was killed by a scorching veto from Jackson. The old hero declared monopolistic bank to be unconstitutional. Of course, the Supreme Court had earlier declared it constitutional in the case of McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819. But Jackson acted as though he regarded the executive branch as superior to the judicial branch. The old general growled privately, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." So this paragraph is very important because remember, McCulloch v. Maryland made the bank constitutional. However, with Jackson vetoing, rejecting the bill to recharter the bank, that means the bank is going to die. That means it's not going to exist. And Jackson goes ahead and he says that he's going to kill it, which in some cases, people believe that he is going against McCulloch v. Maryland. In many ways, he's saying by vetoing it, it's not constitutional, right? But if he's vetoing it, it's just not going to exist, right? Remember, the president does not have the power to rule anything is unconstitutional. Jackson's veto message reverberated with constitutional consequences. It only not squashed the bank bill, but vastly implied the power of the presidency. All previous vetoes had rested almost exclusively on questions of constitutionality. But though Jackson invoked the Constitution in his bank veto message, he essentially argued that he was vetoing the bill because he personally found it harmful to the nation. In effect, he was claiming for the president alone a power equivalent to 2/3 of the votes in Congress. If the legislative and executive branch were partners in government, he implied, the president was unmistakably the senior partner. So what we're looking at here is Jackson's obviously being criticized for kind of abusing his presidential powers. He's saying that with his veto, he's not necessarily trying to prove that he's more powerful than the Supreme Court, but rather what he's saying is that he just doesn't think that this is what's best for America at this point, right? In fact, when we're looking at this, it says so right here that it not only squashed the bank, where was it? There we go. He argued that vetoing the bill because he personally found it harmful to the nation, right? In effect, he was claiming for the president alone a power equivalent to 2/3 of the votes in Congress. So he's saying here that he is of equal power to that. Like he has the power to veto this, right? But of course, many are misjudging him, or they're judging him, sorry, and saying that he has too much power, right? All right. So I'm going to come back to those political cartoons. Henry Clay's political instincts continue to fail him. Delighted with financial fallacies of Jackson's message, but to bind his political appeal, he arranged to have thousands of copies printed as a campaign document. The president's sweeping accusations may indeed have seemed demagogic to the moneyed interests of the East, but they made perfect sense to the common people. The bank issue was now thrown into the noisy arena of the presidential contest of 1832. So what this paragraph is saying is, of course, those that were not part of the wealthy elite support Jackson's veto of the bank, right? $13.10 Old Hickory, Wallops Clay in 1832. Let's go back to these questions really quick. So number 32, why did Jackson not like the National Bank? Who was Nicholas Biddle? Why did Henry Clay try to recharter the bank 4 years early? Why did Jackson veto the charter of the National Bank? So a couple things looking at this question that we want to make sure that we understand. Jackson, of course, doesn't like the National Bank specifically because he believes it's taking advantage of the non-wealthy, the people that were not elite, right? That people such as Nicholas Biddle, the investors in it, they were kind of manipulating the bank, of course, to favor them. Jackson didn't like the fact that he felt the National Bank was purposely just there to make profit, right? Henry Clay tries to recharter the bank 4 years earlier, specifically because he does not necessarily want this issue to come up in the election. In fact, if you go ahead and look right here, just kind of scrolling here, you'll find the exact here. The bank war erupted in 1832 when presented to Congress with the bill. The charter was not set to expire until 1836, but Clay pushed for renewal 4 years earlier to make it an election issue in 1832. Right. So in general, he feels as if we could bring this into the election, we could see where Jackson stands on this. Right. Um, yeah, he feels that if he knows that Jackson is going to veto this, that he's going to become more favorable and therefore he will win the presidency. Clay supports the bank, Jackson doesn't. Clay has an idea that Jackson's going to veto it, right? So he thinks that it's going to favor him in the election and people will vote him instead of Jackson, right? Um, why did Jackson veto the recharter of the National Bank? I kind of said that. I mean, he vetoes it specifically because he has the power to do so. Once again, he feels as if it is favoring the wealthy elite, right? Um, yeah. So, who ran for president in 1830? Brew, and can be habit forming. The ensuing campaign was raucous. The old heroes' adherents again raised the Hickory pole and bellowed Jackson forever, go the whole hog. Admirers of Clay shouted freedom and Clay, while his detractors shaped on his dueling, gambling, cockfighting, and fast living. So in other words, you're getting that campaign term, which means mudslinging again, right? That you're having these candidates, Jackson and Clay, really just criticize each other in ways that might not always be the most moral. Novel features made the campaign of 1832 especially more memorable. For the first time, the third party entered the field, the newborn anti-Masonic Party, which opposed the influence and fearsome of the secrecy of the Masonic Order. Energized by the mysterious disappearance and probable murder in 1826 of a New Yorker who threatened to expose the secret rituals of the Masons, the anti-Masonic Party quickly became a potent political force in New York and spread its influence to the Middle Atlantic and New England states. The anti-Masons appealed to long-standing American suspicions of secret societies, which they condemned as citadels of privilege and monopoly, a note that harmonized with the democratic course of the Jacksonians. But since Jackson himself was a Mason and publicly glorified his membership, the anti-Masonic Party was also an anti-Jackson party. The anti-Masons also attracted support from many evangelical Protestant groups seeking to use political power to effect moral and religious reforms, such as prohibiting mail delivery on Sunday and otherwise keeping the Sabbath holy. This moral busybodiness was anathema to the Jacksonians, who generally opposed to all the government meddling in social and economic life. So to sum things up here, of course, you're going to have Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson run against each other, but you're also going to get a third party, and this third party is going to be the anti-Masonic Party, right? The anti-Masonic Party, they're against the secret rituals of the Masons, which is this elitist group, which many felt that Andrew Jackson was part of, so they're also very anti-Jackson. A further novelty of the presidential contest in 1832 was the calling of national nominating conventions, 3 of them to name candidates. The anti-Masons and a group of national Republicans added still another innovations when they adopted formal platforms, publicizing their positions on issues. Henry Clay and the overconfident National Republicans enjoyed impressive advantages. Ample funds flowed their campaign, including $50,000 in life insurance from the Bank of the United States. Most of the newspaper editors, some of them, bought with Biddle bank loans, dipped their pens in acid when they wrote of Jackson. So in other words, what you're seeing here, Henry Clay is, of course, a National Republican. One of the things that they're saying is that this political party is very wealthy. And of course, you're also getting our guy Biddle. He's kind of just making sure that he's investing in the campaign of Henry Clay, and they're writing very negatively about Andrew Jackson. Okay. Let's go through this. Fist fight between Old Hickory and Bully Nick. An aged President Andrew Jackson faces off against the bank's director, aristocratic Nicholas Biddle. Comically presented as sparing pugilists undressed in the style of the popular sport, the two are assisted by their seconds, Daniel Webster and Henry Clay for Biddle. Vice President Martin Van Buren for Jackson. So what you're seeing here is you're seeing a fight between Jackson and Biddle. Obviously, it represents the bank war, right? Biddle that supports the bank, Andrew Jackson, of course, who wants to close it. And here you also have Henry Clay, who of course supports Biddle, and Vice President Martin Van Buren, who supports Andrew Jackson, right? Yet Jackson, idle the masses, easily defeated the big money Kentuckian. A Jacksonian wave again swept over West and South, surged into Pennsylvania, New York, and even washed into Rock Rib, New England. The popular vote stood at 687,502 to 530,189 for Jackson. The electoral count was lopsided, 219 to 49. So, main thing you understand about this is Jackson wins. Henry Clay totally underestimated the fact that the common man would come out and vote for Jackson. That he totally underestimated the fact that he believed that the bank was something that people would favor, and it wasn't and it wasn't. All right, burying Biddle's bank. So before we bury Biddle's bank, we have who ran for president in 1832, right? Um, what are nominating conventions and platforms? I'll have you go back and use your context clues and go back to that paragraph. Who won the race for presidency in 1832? Of course, that is Andrew Jackson. So now we're going to talk about President Jackson and why he goes ahead and he destroys Biddle's bank and how do you go about this and the idea of pet banks. So let's go through this. Burying Biddle's bank. Burying Biddle's bank. Its charter denied the Bank of the United States was due to expire in 1836, but Jackson was not the one to let the financial octopus die in peace. He was convinced that he could now mandate from the voters for its extermination, and he feared that the slippery Biddle might try to manipulate the bank, as he did, so as to reinforce his charter. Jackson therefore decided in 1833 to bury the bank for good by removing federal deposits from its vaults. He proposed depositing no more funds with Biddle and gradually shrinking existing deposits by using them to defray day-to-day expenses of the government. By slowly sipping off the government's funds, he would bleed the bank dry and ensure its demise. So what Andrew Jackson is doing is he could have just waited for the bank to not be rechartered, but he goes ahead and he takes all the money out of the bank. Removing the deposits involved nasty complications. Even the president's closet advisors opposed his seemingly unnecessary, possibly unconstitutional, and certainly vindictive policy. Jackson, his dander up, was forced to reshuffle his cabinet twice before he could find a Secretary of Treasury who would bend to his iron will. A desperate Biddle called his bank's loans, evidently hoping to illustrate the bank's importance by producing a minor financial crisis. A number of wobblier banks were driven to the wall by Biddle's panic, but Jackson's resolution was firm. If anything, the vengeful conduct of the dying monster seemed to justify the earlier accusations of its adversaries. So what you want to understand here is people fear that there is going to be a financial crisis as a result of taking out all these funds. Jackson, he doesn't care. In fact, his closest cabinet advisors they oppose this. It makes it very difficult for it even to have a consistent treasury, right? Secretary of Treasury, that is, because they fear the instability of these actions. But the death of the Bank of the United States left a financial vacuum in the American economy and kicked off a lurking cycle of booms and busts. Surplus federal funds were placed in several dozen state institutions, the so-called pet banks, chosen for their pro-Jackson sympathies. With a sober central bank in control, the pet banks, smaller wildcat banks, fly-by-night operations that often consisted of little more than a few chairs and a suitcase full of printed notes, flooded the country with paper money. So one of the things that you want to understand that's going on here is with Jackson taking out all this money, he is putting these money and he's investing them in pet banks, and these are banks in which institutions that were created where pro-Jackson sympathizers were in charge of them, right? So that's where all that money is going. They're creating these smaller banks. Jackson tried to rein in the runaway economy in 1836, the year Biddle's bank breathed its last. Wildcat currency had become so unreliable, especially in the West, that Jackson authorized the Treasury to issue a species circular, a decree that required all public lands to be purchased with hard or metallic money. This drastic step slammed the brakes on a speculative boom, a neck-snapping change of direction that contributed to a financial panic and crash in 1837. So the main thing you want to understand about this is that as a result of the national bank closing down, this wildcat currency, these pet banks aren't really working well. They're unpredictable, right? So as a result of this, what Jackson goes ahead and does is he issues a decree that says all land needs to be purchased with hard or metallic money. So you're looking at gold or silver, right? When you're looking at this, This makes people a little bit wary, and they choose not to move westward, or it slams the brakes on investing in lands moving westward. In general, this is going to cause a financial panic in 1837, right? The economy is going to struggle. So far, all in all, what you understand is Jackson closes the banks, the national bank, he creates pet banks, and overall, this is leading to a financial mess. People are not happy. But by then, Jackson had retired in his national home, hailed as a hero of his age. His successor would have to deal with the damage, right? So Jackson did not have to deal with it. So let's go back to our questions here. Um, let's see, where were we? And we explained this. President Jackson decided to destroy his Biddle bank. How did he go about this? You need to make sure that you mention something about pet banks, right? And of course, how did Biddle respond? I mean, he kind of responds in ways that he tries to be he tries to kind of rebuild it, right? But of course, he is not successful in doing so. In fact, Jackson does this so quickly that there's no way. I mean, Biddle has no response, right? In fact, it kind of says so right here. Um, A desperate Biddle called in his bank loans, evidently hoping to illustrate the bank's importance by producing a minor financial crisis. Right, a number of wobblier banks were driven to the wall by Biddle's panic, but Jackson's resolution was firm. If anything, the vengeful conduct of the dying monster seemed to justify the earlier accusation of its adversaries. So he tries, of course, to save the bank. In many ways, he does this in somewhat of a corrupt sense. Right. All right. So the next questions that we're going to look at is by 1830s, what were they calling themselves? Opponents of Jackson's were calling themselves what? And as well as the Whig Party. So let's move forward. The birth of the Whigs. New political parties were gelling as the 1830s lengthened. As early as 1828, the Democratic Republicans of Jackson had unshamefully adopted the once tainted name Democrats. Jackson's opponents, fuming at his iron-fisted exercise of presidential power, condemned him as King Andrew I and began to coalesce as the Whigs, a name deliberately chosen to recollect 18th century British and revolutionary American opposition to the monarchy. So one thing you want to understand is those that are against Andrew Jackson are going to call themselves the Whigs, and it says so right here, is to recollect 18th century British and revolutionary American opposition to the monarchy, because they're considering Andrew Jackson a king. Right? Think about this. He did not listen to Supreme Court. He vetoes law after law. I mean, people are not happy with him. You can think about the nullification crisis, right? How he's imposing the tariffs, and he even threatened to go ahead and hang John C. Calhoun, right? So people feel he is abusing power. The Whig Party contained so many diverse elements that it was mocked at first as an organized incompatibility. Hatred of Jackson and his executive usurpation as its only appearance cement in its formative days. The Whigs first emerged as an identical group in the Senate, where Clay, Webster, and Calhoun joined forces in 1834 to pass a motion censuring Jackson for his single-handed removal of federal deposits from the Bank of the United States. Therefore, the Whigs rapidly evolved into a potent national political force by tracking other groups alienated by Jackson. Supporter of Clay's American system, Southern states writers, offended by Jackson's stand on nullification, the larger Northern industrialists and merchants, and eventually many of the evangelical Protestants associated with the anti-Masonic Party. So in other words, you're looking at this Whig. The Whigs are basically everybody that hates Jackson. Everybody from evangelical Protestants, right, who believe that that Jackson's part of the Masons, right? You're also looking at people that of the South, right, that were angry at Jackson for the nullification crisis and the tariffs, to people in the Senate, such as Clay and Webster and Calhoun. So this paragraph basically says you have a diverse group of people that hate Andrew Jackson. Whigs saw themselves as conservatives, yet they were progressive in their support of active government programs and reforms. Instead of boundless territorial acquisition, they called for internal improvements like canals, railroads, and telegraph lines, and they supported institutions like prisons, asylums, and public schools. The Whigs welcomed the market economy, drawing support from manufacturers in the North, planters in the South, and merchants and bankers in all actions. But they were not simply a party of wealthy fat cats. However, clearly the Democrats wanted to paint them as such. By absorbing the anti-Masonic Party, the Whigs blunted much of the Democratic appeal to the common man. The egalitarian anti-Masons portrayed Jackson, and particularly his New York successor, Martin Van Buren, as imperious aristocrats. This turned Jacksonian rhetoric on its head. Now the Whigs claimed to be the defenders of the common man and declared that the Democrats the party of cronyism and corruption. So what you're looking at here is what you understand. It's just the portrayal of one party versus the portrayal of the other, right? The Whigs, what they really stand for is they stand for a free market economy. They're drawing a lot of supports from manufacturers, planters in the South, bankers in all sections, but they weren't necessarily that wealthy, right? And the Democrats kind of painted them as that. On the other hand, what you're also getting is you're also getting the Whigs that are trying now to go ahead and present Jackson as that of an aristocrat, someone that's very rich and wealthy. So everyone's kind of trying to go ahead and grab the common man's vote. Okay. So if we go back to our questions here, what 5 groups joined the Whig Party? Right. This question is very important, specifically because it shows the diversity of the Whig Party. So you want to mention all those that were mentioned, such as the anti-Freemasons. You also want to make sure that you mention politicians, right, such as Henry Clay. But all those groups that were mentioned specifically in that last section here, when we are looking at the birth of the Whigs, right? And you will find it in this paragraph. So you don't need to mention them. I mean, just people in terms of the groups or in the issues that they supported, right? Well, what candidates ran for in president 1836 and who won and why? Well, we're about to get to that right now. The election of 1836. Yeah, the election of 1836. So really quick, I kind of just want to make sure. I felt like I was kind of vague. The 5 groups, with that question that they're looking at, they're mentioning here in this paragraph. They're not necessarily 5 specific groups, but you're looking at just individuals and what they are, just geographic groups, right? Supporters of Clay American Southern states, right? Offended by nullification, the larger northern industrious merchants, and eventually the evangelical Protestants. So all those elements right there. So let's go on to the next one. The smooth-tongued and keen-witted Vice President Martin Van Buren in New York was Jackson's choice for appointment as a successor in 1836. The hollow-cheeked Jackson, now nearing 70, was too old, ailing to consider a third term, but he was not loath to try and serve a third term, though Van Buren, something of a yes man, leaving nothing to chance. Jackson carefully rigged the nominating convention and rammed his favorite down the throats of the delegates. Van Buren was supported by Jacksonites without wild enthusiasm, even though he had promised to tread generally in the military booted footsteps of his predecessor. What this paragraph is basically saying in 1836 is that the Jacksonites, they weren't really sure of Martin Van Buren. However, Andrew Jackson, he kind of made sure, right, that he would become the delegate for the party, right, for the Jacksonian Democrats. And Martin Van Buren says he's going to follow in his footsteps. As the election neared, the still ramshackle organization, the Whigs, showed an ability to nominate a single presidential candidate. The long shot strategy was instead to run several prominent favorite sons with a different regional appeal, and to hope to scatter the vote so that no candidate would win the majority. The deadlock would then have to be broken up by the House of Representatives, where the Whigs might have a chance. With Henry Clay rudely elbowed aside, the leading Whig favorite son was heavy-jawed General William Henry Harrison of Ohio, hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. The fine-spun schemes of the Whigs availed nothing. However, Van Buren, the dapper little magician, squirmed into office by the popular vote of 765,483 to 739,785, but by the comfortable margin of 170 to 124 votes in the Electoral College. So what you want to understand about this paragraph right here, what they're basically saying is, remember, in order to win the election, you need the majority of Electoral College votes. So what the Whigs decide to do is they try to, with their candidate, Henry Clay, they go ahead, with Henry Clay rudely elbowed aside, the leading candidate was actually William Henry Harrison. I apologize. Remember him from the Battle of Tippecanoe. But what the Whigs try to do is a majority of people try to do is they try to go ahead and put in as many candidates as possible, specifically so it would be hard to go ahead and get a majority, right? In fact, this says here, as election neared, the Stimshack organization, the Whigs, showed their inability to nominate a single presidential candidate. What they wanted to do was go ahead and have several people run independent so they could scatter the vote, meaning that no one could get a majority and then it could go to the House. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is the Jacksonian Democrats are very victorious and they win the majority electoral college vote. So that was kind of wordy. All in all, what you understand about that is the Whigs are not successful in terms of trying to ensure that the Jacksonian Democrats do not win, and Martin Van Buren is the next president. Um, so when we go there, what candidates ran for president, who won, and why, and we're going to go ahead and get Van Buren specifically because he gets the majority in the electoral college. Okay. Big woes for Little Magician, right? Martin Van Buren, eighth president, was the first to be born under the American flag. Short and slender, bland and bald, adroit little New Yorker, has been described as the first class, second rate man, an accomplished strategist and spoilsman, the Wizard of Albany. He was also a statesman of wide experience in both legislative and administrative life. In intelligence, education, training, he was above the average of the presidents since Jefferson. The myth of his mediocrity sprouted mostly from a series of misfortune over which he had no control. So this is kind of foreshadowing here. What you want to kind of just understand about this paragraph is that he is the first American-born president. He's a New Yorker, very intelligent. Unfortunately, a lot of things that end up happening as a presidency, he has no control over. Right? He's smart, probably one of the smartest ones since Jefferson. He just has bad luck. Next paragraph. From the outset, the new president labored under severe handicaps. As a machine-made candidate, he incurred the resentment of many Democrats, those who objected to having a bastard politician smuggled into the office beneath the tails of the old general's military coat. Jackson, the master showman, had been a dynamic type of executive whose administration had resounded with fierce quarrels and cracked heads. Mild-mannered Martin Van Buren seemed to rattle about in the military boots of his testy predecessor. The people felt let down. Inheriting Andrew Jackson's mantle without his popularity, Van Buren also inherited the ex-president's numerous and vengeful enemies. So in other words, what they're saying in this paragraph is, when they're saying a machine-made candidate, meaning that he's not running on his own issues, right? I mean, he's made by the Democratic machine. He's made by the Democratic political party. The reason why he's in power is specifically because Andrew Jackson kind of pre-selected him. What this paragraph also says, though, is unfortunately, he doesn't have the personality. He doesn't have that ruffian characteristic that Andrew Jackson does. And unfortunately, the bad thing is he also inherits a lot of Andrew Jackson's enemies, right? Van Buren's 4 years, next paragraph, overflowed with toil and trouble. A pair of short-lived rebellions in Canada in 1837, mostly over political reform, but aggravated by unregulated immigration from the United States, stirred up ugly incidents along the northern frontier, threatened to trigger war with Britain. The president's attempt to play a neutral game led to the whale, woe to Martin Van Buren. The anti-slavery agitators in the North were also in full cry. Among other grievances, they were condemning the prospective annexation of Texas. So a couple things he has to deal with. You're getting a lot of illegal immigration during this time, and also Texas would like to go ahead and become Texas eventually is going to gain their independence, and they want to become part of America. And the issue we have to deal with is, will they be a slave or a free state? Right? Upon Moses Austin's death in 1821, the task of realizing his dream fell to his 27-year-old Stephen. I've been in. Sorry. Let me move on. Moses Austin, born in Connecticut, Yankee in 1761, was determined to be Spanish, if that's what it looks to acquire cheap land and freedom from pesky laws. In 1798, he trapped into untracked Missouri, still part of the Spanish Louisiana, and he pledged allegiance to the King of Spain. He was not pleased when the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 restored him to American citizenship. In 1820, with his old Spanish passport and saddlebag, he rode to Spanish Texas and asked for permission to establish a colony of 300 families. So this is where we're going to get that term. Austin, Texas, right? So you're getting Moses Austin, and the idea here is he wants to be Spanish, or he is Spanish. But remember, that Spanish territory of Louisiana eventually becomes French, which is sold to America. And he settles in Texas, right? Or what is now Texas, to establish his own colony, right? And the Spanish approved this. Next paragraph. Austin's request posed a dilemma for the Texas governor. The Spanish authorities had repeatedly stamped out the bands of American horse thieves and squatters who periodically splashed across the Red and Sabine rivers from the United States into Spanish territory. Yet the Spanish had lured only some 3,000 of their own settlers into Texas during their 3 centuries of rule. If the land were ever to be wrested from the Indians and civilized, maybe Austin's plans could do it. Hoping that this band of the right sort of Americans might prevent the further encroachment of buckskin border ruffians, the governor reluctantly agreed to Austin's proposal. So Austin goes ahead and he establishes a colony, right, in that territory, right, in Spanish territory. Upon Moses Austin's death in 1821, the task of realizing his dream fell to his 27-year-old son, Stephen. I bid an everlasting farewell to my native country, Stephen Austin said, as he crossed into Texas on July 5th, 1821, determined to fulfill rigidly all the duties and obligations of a Mexican citizen. Mexico declared its independence from Spain early in 1821 and finally realized its agreement with Austin in 1823. Soon he learned fluent Spanish, and he was just signing his name as Don Esteban F. Austin. In his youth colony between the Brazos and the Colorado rivers, he allowed no drunkard, no gambler, no profane swearer, no idler, and sternly enforced these rules. Not only did he banish several families as undesirable, but he ordered public flogging of unwanted interlopers. So what we're getting here is he goes ahead and we're getting the colony of Texas that it's established. We're getting Stephen Austin here that's going ahead and he's establishing his colony. And it's a very strict colony. You know, that's one thing you understand. It's a moral colony, right? Yeah, I mean, that's the evidence that we have there. The fact that he is banishing those that are undesirable, right? Austin just fell 3 short of recruiting the 300,000 households that his father had contracted to bring to Texas. The original settlers were still dubbed the Old 300, the Texas equivalent of New England's Mayflower Pilgrims, or the first families of Virginia. Mostly Scotch-Irish Southerners from the Trans-Appalachian frontier, the Old 300 were cultured folk of the frontier standards. All before them were illiterate. Other settlers followed from Europe as well as America. With 10 years, the Anglos outnumbered the Mexican residents, or Tejanos, 10-1, and soon evolved a distinctive Texan culture. The wide-ranging horse patrols organized to attack the Indian camps and became the Texas Rangers. Samuel Maverick, whose unbranded calves roamed the limitless prairies, left his surname as a label for rebellious loners who refused to run with the herd, and Jared Gross, an Alabama planter whose caravan of 50 covered wagons and 100 slaves arrived in 1822, etched an image of larger-than-life big-time Texas operator. The original Anglo-Texans brought with them old Scot-Irishmen's hostility to authority. They ignored Mexican laws and officials, including restrictions against owning or importing slaves. When the Mexican government tried to impose its will on the Anglo-Texans in the 1830s, they took up their guns. Like the American revolutionaries in the 1770s, who at first demanded only the rights of Englishmen, the Texans began by asking simply for Mexican recognition of their rights as guaranteed by the Mexican Constitution of 1824. Bloodshed at the Alamo in 1836, like that of Lexington Concord, and in 1775, transported protests and rebellion. So we have a lot going on here, and I just want to kind of just double check, make sure you have some understanding. Right. So what you understand here is you're getting Moses Austin. He's a Yankee. He wanted to be Spanish, right? So what he ends up doing in the second paragraph, he requests to impose a dilemma for the Texas governor, right? Or actually, sorry, let's go take a step back. In 1820, with his old Spanish passport and a sailbag, he wrote to Spanish Texas and asked for permission to establish a colony of 300 families, right? So he goes ahead and he does that. A couple things that we want to understand, though, was yet as we move forward here, Mexico is going to also go ahead and declare its independence, right? Stephen said that as he crossed into Texas on July 15, 1821, right, Mexico declared its independence from Spain early in 1821 and finalized its agreement with Austin in 1823 that he could still have his colony of Texas, but of course it's going to be Mexican territory. So we end up getting here is we're getting the war between Mexico and Texas, right, at the Alamo in 1836. Okay. Texas lay and still lies along the frontier of Hispanic and Anglo-American cultures that mingled and clashed. In part, the Texas Revolution was a contest between two cultures, but it was also a contest about philosophies of government, pitting liberal frontier ideals of American against a conservative concept of centralized control. Stephen Austin sincerely tried to Mexicanize himself and his followers until the Mexican government grew too arbitrary and authoritarian. And not all the Texas revolutionaries were Anglo. Many Tejanos fought for Texas independence. 7 perished defending the Alamo. Among the 59 signers of the Texas Declaration of Independence were several Hispanics, including the Tejanos Jose Antonio Navarro and Francisco Ruiz. Lorenzo de Zavala, an ardent Mexico liberal who had long resisted the centralized tendencies of Mexico's dominant political party and was designated vice president in the Texas Republic's interim government in 1836. Like the Austins, these Tejanos and Mexicans had sought in Texas an escape from overbearing governmental authority. Their role in the revolution underscores the fact that the uprising was a struggle between defenders of local rights and agents of central authority as much as it was a fight between Anglo and Mexican cultures. So this paragraph is basically saying that you're getting a war of independence. You're getting a war between Texas and Mexico, but it wasn't a war of culture. It was more of a political war, a war of independence, and a war of just political freedom. Yeah. So coming in here, worst of all, Jackson believed to Van Buren the makings of a Syrian depression. Much of Van Buren's energy had to be devoted to the purely negative task of battling the panic, and there was not enough rabbits in the little magician so tall silk hack. Hard times ordinarily brought the reputation of a president, and Van Buren was no exception. Okay. So this kind of jumped around here, but obviously one thing you want to understand, the issue that's going to come up is Texas gains its independence, and we need to figure out is they want to be annexed, right? They want to be part of America. But the issue is, are they going to be slave or free state? All right. So we kind of went over all of this, right? The Mexican government invited who into Texas, right? How many Americans were in Texas by 1835? What were the issues, cause, and friction between Texas and Santa Anna's American government? So, I mean, that was all kind of in that last thing that I just read for you guys. Okay. I apologize. It did kind of go quick, but it's getting late. We will go ahead and I will continue the next portion in the next video.